Hi, I'm Elliot Temple. I do philosophy. I've been writing at the Harry Binswanger Letter. It's a private forum. Well, it's a paid forum, but anyone can join. But it's primarily for objectivists. The site is hbletter.com. I will put the link in the description. We've been discussing epistemology, especially. This thread I started, Mistakes of Karl Popper, is around 58,000 words so far. And there's several other threads on related topics. And what I'm going to do is show my writing process when I reply to some of the posts today. So here's the last post by me in this induction topic. I already read all the replies, but only briefly, and I'm going to go in more detail now. I don't understand why people ask this. Yes, I'm serious. Yes, I mean what I say. What are they hoping to accomplish? Do they think I'm going to say, no, I was just joking? Is it not a question, but trying to express that they disagree, like, a lot instead of a little bit? He says it's primacy of consciousness, but I don't agree at all. I didn't mention consciousness. I talked about physical facts of eyes. So, eyes can see green, but not infrared. Now, I'm confident that he agrees with that you can see green but not infrared. If you want to see infrared, you have to build some technological tools or something. But you can see green without special tools, just because your eyes are built in such a way that they see green but not infrared. He knows that, he agrees with that, yet he still has a very negative reaction. So why is that? It presumably is either about raw observation or about eyes being, quote, opinionated. So, by opinionated, I mean that eyes are designed one way rather than another. There isn't one type of tool or sense apparatus for seeing. There are many different types, each one with different advantages and disadvantages, strengths and weaknesses. There isn't just a canonical thing called sight, and then humans have sight so humans can see and that's it. There's many different types of sight. The way a frog sees and the way a human sees are somewhat different. And the way a bee sees is different again. People know this. They know that dogs can hear frequencies that humans can't hear. They know that, I think bees can see ultraviolet offhand. Something like that. Let's check. Yeah, bees can see ultraviolet. Right? Not a big deal. That there's different types of eyes that have different effects. And then we build cameras, and different cameras have different advantages and disadvantages. Depending on your camera, you can see more or less detail. And it's the same thing with eyes. Human eyes have only a certain resolution of how much detail they can see. And they have a certain angle of how wide a picture you can see at once. And you have two of them. But you could have like 5 eyes. You could have an eye in the back of your head and see backwards. You could have 360 vision, but you don't. But you could build a camera setup with cameras pointing in all directions and have 360 vision. So our eyes are opinionated in the sense that there are design decisions that go into our eyes to make them one way and not another. Those decisions are not made by an intelligence, they're made by evolution, by selection pressure, which creates knowledge, so it's more or less the same thing as an intelligent decision. I figure HB will deny that. Will deny that evolution and knowledge have anything to do with each other. But I don't think he has... I don't know what he says about evolution. Like, how does he explain it and what it's doing? And why is he disintegrating it from knowledge? When you see there's a lot of overlap between evolution and human thinking. You got the appearance of design. You got things that are like design decisions. You got things that are adapted to a purpose. Humans take ideas and adapt them to a purpose. So you got an idea that's not just a random idea, but has been selected and adapted and optimized, and whatever you want to call it, to work for a particular purpose. But when he reads opinionated, I guess, is he thinking that I'm saying eyes are conscious and have opinions like humans? In the sense of, like, conscious thinking? And that, therefore, the eye consciousness has primacy? And sort of determines reality? Like, I don't think that would be a reasonable interpretation of what I meant. If he didn't understand what I meant, that would make more sense to me. If he said, I don't understand what you're talking about, how can an eye be opinionated? But when he says it's primacy of consciousness, he's saying that he does understand what I mean. and it is primacy of consciousness, and he's mistaken, and it's an avoidable mistake. Maybe there's some other interpretation of what I mean that he has, but it's still, it wouldn't be hard for him to guess that he's not understanding what I mean, rather than just saying it's primacy of consciousness. He thinks that whatever his reading is like the correct reading, but that's not a reasonable thing to believe in this conversation because of our recent discussion history. Our recent discussion history involves misunderstanding after misunderstanding after misunderstanding. It involves over and over him reading Popperian statements using objectivist premises for part of his interpretation, and therefore coming to conclusions that aren't at all what we mean. That's a very natural and understandable thing to do, but it's also important to recognize that it's going on, and not to think that your interpretations are actually what the other person is talking about. Because Popper disputes a bunch of premises, and therefore is able to come to a different conclusion than you would from a particular argument. It's also, there's the part about raw observation. Maybe he has an issue with that. So there's a concept people have about raw observation, where it's totally unbiased and unopinionated. So it's a myth, though. It's like if there was one canonical camera that just sees correctly, rather than a bunch of different cameras with different design decisions. The idea of raw observation would just be, actual data about what's there, instead of selective design decisions about what way to record data, which data to record, in what form. If you wanted, actual raw observation, you'd need to, measure everything. Just get all of the information. So you wouldn't be losing any information, you'd be copying everything. That might be possible in special cases, in very limited, white room scenarios, clean room scenarios, where you're just recording a very limited thing, if you shoot one photon at a measuring device, is it possible to copy all the information from the photon? I kind of doubt it, but I'm not sure. Maybe it's possible in theory, but way beyond present technology. Anyway, what our eyes do is absolutely nothing like that. They record a very small portion of all the information in the photons that reaches them, and a different portion of the information than a bee's eyes record. And then the information that our eyes record is then processed before it gets to our mind. So if you imagine some future scientists with amazing technology, and there's two different ones, and one of them hooks into your brain right at the eye and records all the information that your eyes get. And the second guy hooks into the end of your optic nerve at the other end right before your mind, instead of right after your eye. And so the question is does the second guy have all the information the first guy has? And the answer is no. Along the optic nerve, information processing happens, and some of the information is changed and lost. The information processing is done in an opinionated way to detect certain kinds of features that evolution has found were helped. Evolution had selection pressure to figure out which information in the visual information is actually useful and helpful for survival. And so it put some algorithms in, which process the information in an irreversible way where you're losing information, so it's not raw. Even if the eye had raw observation, which it doesn't, you're still losing information after the eye, before the mind. This is just basic science. I don't think anything I've said so far is controversial. And yet, here I am, being asked if I'm serious, and getting an accusation about wild, not just primacy of consciousness, but wild primacy of consciousness. So why does he think? Let's see what he says. Concepts are formed from perception. So this is a premise from objectivism that I don't agree with. So what he's doing is taking his premise, my claim, putting them together, and getting a bad idea. That doesn't mean that I said something bad. It doesn't mean that what I wrote as stated is bad. It means what I wrote as stated, plus premises that I disagree with, lead to stuff, bad conclusions. Of course that's going to happen. Of course, part of my philosophy combined with part of his philosophy, depending which parts you pick, that's not going to come out very well because there are things we disagree about. If it is impossible for a 3-month-old to have raw observation, then he would be unable to form concepts. So this doesn't make any sense because even if concepts are formed from perception, they could be formed from non-raw observation. There's no reason the observation has to be raw to form concepts from it. I think he doesn't know what raw means, and that he's assuming raw means something like related to reality, which it doesn't. It means, is all the information present? Helen Keller is a huge tangent, which I'm not going to go into. I don't think that saying what our claims imply about Helen Keller is going to get us anywhere. We don't perceive everything, okay. I agree, but we perceive enough. I agree. Totally agree. I didn't say that they overwhelm us. So this is another misunderstanding. A lot of things get read into what I say that have very little to do with my position. I said that the myriad of possibilities create logical problems for certain philosophy claims. I did not say they overwhelm people. People have a way to deal with it. Now I claim that the way people deal with it is neither being overwhelmed nor doing what objectivists think people do, which has logical problems. Rather, people are not overwhelmed and deal with it without raw observation, with their opinionated eyes, using conjectures and refutations, and the critical method, using error correction, using evolutionary epistemology, all that stuff. So it's an importation of an adult perspective into the world of a child. No, it's not. It's a logical issue. When you're claiming, induction works by finding similarities, which similarities? It's not clear instructions on what to do when you say find similarities and you don't say which ones. And if you say find similarities in an intelligent way, then it becomes circular if you're trying to explain intelligence. Gavaji problem. I'm not familiar with it by that name, but I might know it if we look up what it actually is. Okay, that's pretty funny. That's a good story. But what's the point of it? Okay, this is true. You can't just do it by a finite set of observations. You have to think. And therefore, thinking can't just start with observation. It's not a disastrous conclusion. It's perfectly acceptable. It simply ruins the inductivist perspective. But that's okay because we don't need induction because there's evolutionary epistemology. It's not just some degree of uncertainty. Without intelligent thought, just with algorithmic math, it's not that you have some degree of uncertainty about which thing Gavaji is. It's that you have absolutely no way to say what it is. It's not that you find the right answer, but it's only 99% sure. Logically, there's just no way to find the answer whatsoever. In order to find the answer of what it refers to, you have to use intelligent thinking, which has to work by some process that comes before observation and pattern matching and this other stuff. Because any finite set of observations is compatible with infinite different patterns, infinite different correct meanings of the word Gavaji. So, until you bring up a method of choosing between the many different patterns, it's not that you're just uncertain Gavaji means rabbit. You have no information about what it means without doing intelligent analysis. When you look at it just purely from a data and algorithm perspective, there's no way to do it at all. Which is a big deal because people say, basically, induction is the basis of thinking. But induction doesn't work without already being able to think. Because you get stuck on these things like the finite set of observations not telling you what Gavaji means. It doesn't even hint at it. People think it hints at it because they do things like they say, oh, well, he pointed at the rabbit and he said Gavaji like 20 times. Therefore, it probably refers to rabbits. But when they do that, they're not doing induction anymore. They're doing intelligent thinking. They're not, at that point, able to explain where do you get the type of thinking that lets you figure out what pointing is. Where do you get the type of thinking that lets you come up with explanations like he's trying to communicate and he's using pointing to help me understand the word. Explanations like that have to come before you get anywhere with observation, but then their epistemology tries to put observation first, so they're stuck. It doesn't work. Okay, so what does he actually say about this? He doesn't say what his point about the problem is. Well, he puts problem in quotes, so I guess he thinks it's a non-problem. But logically, it is a problem. It's an important logical point, and your epistemology has to deal with it. If you just sort of ignore a logical point because you think it contradicts reality or contradicts that you know people have knowledge, that's not a very intellectual way to deal with it. I agree that people have knowledge, people know. There's some sort of thinking that works. But it's completely wrong to get from, our cell phones work. We have spaceships, therefore people can know things and skepticism is wrong. So far I agree. But if you go from there to perception works the way objectivists think, concepts are formed from perception, induction works, etc., none of those are implied by the existence of cell phones. When you get to a contradiction, the Gavaji argument seems to imply skepticism to you, but you know skepticism is wrong. Now you have a contradiction, you need to check your premises. Maybe we get knowledge by a different way than the way you thought we did, because there's this logical problem with the way you thought we got knowledge. But we have knowledge. So we do it a different way. You either have to solve the logical problem, or find a different approach to epistemology that doesn't have the logical problem. You don't just get to ignore the logical problem and put scare quotes around it. But they misunderstand what the point is. They talk about people being overwhelmed. It's not a matter of being overwhelmed, it's a logical problem. That's a completely different kind of thing. And it's not artificial. When you or a child looks at the world, you see stuff. And that stuff is a finite data set. This is not artificial, that is a literal experience that everyone has. And then there's a problem of so we know people do make sense of the stuff that they're seeing. They don't get overwhelmed with it. Sometimes people get overwhelmed, but in general, people, a lot of the time, are understanding what they see. They have ways to do that. So there's a question of what way do they do it? That's not an artificial problem to wonder what the way is. And then, Quinn's Gavaji issue tells us something about what way they do it. It tells us they can't just do it by pattern matching with a finite data set because there's infinite patterns that fit the data set. So you can't just pick the pattern, or you can't say, okay, there's 5 patterns and now I'm going to pick between them, because there's infinite patterns. So you need a completely different method that doesn't rely on going through all the patterns, and doesn't rely on there being only a small finite number of patterns, and you just notice the pattern, because there's many patterns. The many patterns are not overwhelming, logically, you can't just say something like find the 5 patterns or find the 1 pattern. That doesn't work when there's many. You need some sort of other method of dealing with the many patterns, such as Popper talks about the spotlight theory of knowledge, where you decide what to look for selectively. You're basically shining a spotlight of your attention on the things that you consider important according to ideas you already have. Now, epistemology can't start there, but that is a later phase of Popperian epistemology. The important point is epistemology also can't just start with observe a finite data set, find the pattern, find the similarities, find the differences. Because find which ones? There's no way to say which ones if that's your complete starting point of epistemology. It takes intelligent thinking of some kind, or some sort of algorithm that no one can specify to figure out which ones. So this is not putting an adult perspective on the world of a child. A child sees a finite data set. It's not a practical problem either. As a practical matter, people look around and they see that's a dog, that's a door, that's a table. There isn't a practical problem here. People are able to think, they do think. I mean, there are some ways that knowing epistemology is practical, but I wouldn't primarily call this a practical problem. It's a philosophical problem, which will then help with practical life in some indirect ways, once you understand it. But the problem I'm bringing up is a philosophical problem. It's not which one is the most productive. There are infinitely many features, infinitely many of which are not productive at all. So if you just pick randomly, you're not going to get anywhere. You won't be able to know anything. So there has to be a different method. You can't just randomly pick some. Randomly picking some does not get you a loss of efficiency, where if you focus on random patterns, it's not just like you get an 80% correct answer or a 90% correct answer when, with better choices, you could have gotten a 99% correct answer. If you focus on random patterns, you're not going to know anything at all, ever. There's a major logical problem there, and a solution is needed. Popperian epistemology solves this problem. Objectivists, rather than solve this problem, they put scare quotes around it and misunderstand it. For example, misunderstanding it as a practical problem of how to sort of maximize productivity, when it's a logical problem of how to know anything at all. And they also misunderstand it as skepticism, because I'm saying their method of epistemology cannot know anything at all, ever. It's impossible, it doesn't work. So they go, oh my god, he's such a skeptic. But I'm not saying skepticism, I'm saying there's a different method that actually does work, but yours doesn't. Check your premises. But they have a lot of trouble understanding that. Because they have some sort of package deal in their head, as far as I can tell, where knowledge and non-skepticism is packaged up with all this other stuff about certainty, induction, perception, concept formation. And so when you say parts of their system don't work, they feel like you're attacking the whole system, including knowledge. And this is made more complicated because their understanding of knowledge is incorrect. So I can't defend entirely their concept of what knowledge is. You have to understand knowledge the correct way, or it actually isn't gettable. But it's still not skepticism to say knowledge is a bit different than you thought it was, and also we can get it. And that allows for the creation of cell phones and X-ray scanners, and so on. As long as the type of knowledge that I'm saying we can get, the meaning of it, allows for learning philosophy, allows for industrial civilization, etc., then you can quibble over details, but that's pretty different than skepticism, or nihilism, or anything like that. Tables have okay. So here, he just sort of ignores the problem. He's misunderstanding that it's a logical problem, which shows that learning doesn't work in the way he thinks it does. He says, as a practical matter, the child forming the table confronts no. No, the child does confront that problem. He just does something else. If the child tried to do what HB says is how people learn, the child would run straight into that problem and never learn anything ever in his whole life. However, that's not how people think. They don't think in the objectivist way. They think in an evolutionary way. Primarily, this is subconscious. Most thinking is below the conscious level. And so a lot of this stuff gets sorted out before it even gets in the correct way, before it even gets to the conscious mind. Which is one of the reasons people can have misconceptions about epistemology and still learn things, is because their conscious misconceptions about epistemology don't prevent their unconscious mind from working in the effective way that evolution programmed it to work. That's not to say people have no control over their unconscious, and you can, depending on your conscious theories and what ideas of epistemology and other things you have, and how consistently you hold them and stuff, you can have a lot of control over your unconscious and how it works and how well it works and what kinds of conclusions it comes to. And so you get someone like Ayn Rand, who you can bring up an issue to her, and very, very quickly she'd have a great answer. And a lot of that would be done unconsciously. It would just come to her. And then other people, you bring up the same issue, and they either don't have an answer quickly or they have a bad answer quickly. Because, one's explicit philosophy does have a large effect on one's unconscious thinking. And things like understanding evolutionary epistemology at a conscious level and thinking in terms of things like brainstorming and critical discussion rather than induction does help. But the very young child doesn't have either conscious epistemology. He's not familiar with theories of induction or theories of critical rationalism, but he can still think because his brain at the unconscious level has a genetically coded computer that's doing evolution of ideas. It's doing the evolutionary epistemology stuff, and that's how he's able to look out at a table and figure out it's a table. Anyway, the point is, saying the child has no problem figuring out a table as a table doesn't tell you anything about which way he did it between rival views on how a person figures out a table as a table. It contradicts skepticism, of course, I agree, but it doesn't tell you that the child knows it's a table using induction. It doesn't tell you that the child did concept formation in the way described in HB's book, How We Know. So he's missing the point rather badly here. He's not realizing, okay, there's a rival view on how we know, which also says, yes, children can understand tables. When I talk about these logical problems with the myriad possibilities, I'm saying that they present a problem for some epistemologies. But when he points out that children are able to form the concept table, that doesn't contradict me. Of course they can. Why is he saying that? Because he thinks somehow it proves his point. All it does, though, is prove that a child can do that in some way. It doesn't prove they can do it in the way HB thinks they do it. There's a different method, which is not look at the zillion characteristics and then find the pattern. The different method involves starting with ideas and evolving them and using observations in a critical role and selecting which things to observe according to your ideas. Which is sort of common sense, but, here HB is saying concept formation comes first, and you look at similarities. So his epistemology has things in the wrong order. I asked him about this, and he basically said, if you form a concept for a useless similarity, that's still knowledge and proper concept formation. Which I think is a really bad answer, because then there's this infinite set of things that he'll consider knowledge, most of which are arbitrary and useless. And if all you ever did was create knowledge of that type, you'd never get anywhere. It's crucial that you actually are focusing on things that are important, because the unimportant absolutely does overwhelm the important. There's a lot more stuff than important stuff. So if you're not selective, you would be overwhelmed. You have to be selective. Right, and you got definitions like this. Does she mean, when she says the same characteristics, I think she means some characteristics are the same, not all. Like two different dogs can be in different places. Place is kind of interesting because having a place is a characteristic that two dogs share, but which place they're in is a characteristic they do not share. Anyway, she can't possibly mean all characteristics are the same. So some characteristics are the same. Okay, but pick any two things and they possess some of the same characteristics. So how do you pick which characteristics to care about? This is an important problem. And you can't just start epistemology by saying, pick the ones with some similar characteristics and form concepts. Because at that point, if you're just saying start here, you have no way to know which characteristics are important, which ones to pay attention to. In Popperian epistemology, also, this issue isn't just about the beginnings of thought. It's not just about children. There's very similar issues when it comes to adults. So, with an adult, you can take it as a given that they know a bunch of stuff, they have an intelligent mind, and so on. And in Popperian epistemology, they still use the same method. It's not a new method. And the method involves, you have some ideas which guide what you observe. You make observations according to ideas that you have a hypothesis about something, and then you make an observation that's relevant to your hypothesis, which will potentially get you useful information or contradicting information. And so you observe in a selective way, looking for relevant information out of the many, many things you could observe. And then once you do that observation, then you integrate that into your thinking. You rule out some ideas that it contradicts, and you see if it gives you you see if you're able to use it in your brainstorming to come up with any better ideas, any new ideas about it. And there's an interplay where you go back and forth between improving your ideas and then observing some more stuff related to what your ideas say is worth observing, and then improving your ideas again and then observing again, and so on. Not that you have to close your eyes while you're thinking, but with objectivism, they're not talking about perceiving, they're not talking about selective observation. They're always talking about sort of you just look at the world and you perceive. They want things like raw observation rather than opinionated observation. And that's an issue for adults too. Even if we agree the adult has opinions on what to observe, if you're observing according to those opinions, now you have opinionated observation. Whereas objectivism cares about things like raw observation. And it's the same issue with similarity, where you can only figure out similarities according to opinions you already have about which similarities are worth caring about, which similarities are notable. Whereas objectivism keeps talking about it in terms of basically find these similarities. Rather than use your opinions to decide which similarities are important, it's more just, there are similarities, think in the correct way and you'll find the similarities. It doesn't want the similarities you find to be based on your opinions, because then, if you have bad opinions, you'll be sort of screwed. And they're worried that that's too subjective, that there's a human choice element involved. But there are human decisions about how to think, and they do affect what conclusions you come to and how good your knowledge is. And that's okay, because yes, some people will think badly, but others will do well. So, it's not that a beagle and a collie are similar, and a beagle and a rock are dissimilar, in a raw, unopinionated way. That's not like a fact of reality. The fact of reality is a beagle and a rock have many characteristics in common, infinitely many, and many characteristics not in common, also infinitely many. And it's the same thing with the beagle and the collie. The beagle and the collie are only more similar when you start factoring in human values, human opinions, human ideas about what types of similarities are important and what types to disregard. The beagle and the collie only become more similar once you have a person making judgments about what's arbitrary, what doesn't matter. But objectivism treats it more like a fact of reality than an implication of one's theories. I'll go through these other posts briefly before I worry about replying to HB. I have these views on the matter, but deciding which things to reply is difficult because I keep being misunderstood and I can't explain everything at once. There's too much to learn. There's too many differences to get from his perspective to mine to just do it all in one step. So I have to make choices about what ideas to explain first, what order to put things in, what can I have to try to look for sort of a step-by-step process for him to get from his current ideas to understanding what I'm saying. And that's very tricky. And I also have to worry about the audience while doing it. Most of the audience is not paying very close attention, so if I just sort of argue over minute details, they either get bored or they take things out of context. Whereas if I write in a more like self-contained essays that are introductory essays, then it works better for the audience because they can just read a random post and be like, oh, that made sense. Rather than having the experience of coming in the middle of a very pedantic, detailed discussion, which doesn't work well for the large majority of the audience that isn't paying close attention, and also just isn't very precise in their thinking. However, in terms of dealing with HB, there's definitely advantages to going into lots of little details and picking on, exact words, like he used the word wild here. Most of the audience would not care about a lengthy discussion of his use of the word wild, but it might be relevant and productive to talk about that for HB personally, because the details of what he said do matter to him. They just don't matter to most of the other people. Picky points, pedantic points, like word lawyering, as people would call it, who don't like precision, they're actually quite often, not always, some of it's definitely people will argue details because they can't win the argument and they don't know what to do, and it seems like a way to attack and knock things down that's easier than trying to figure out the truth. But it's also true that, dealing with the fine details and dealing with little misconceptions and misunderstandings is important in a good discussion. But most of the audience doesn't follow along, so it doesn't work well for them. But when you try to bring everything back to the high-level issues in order to keep the audience interested, it makes it hard to get the details across. The more you're saying introductory things and focusing on the big issues, the more you're leaving out the little details that the actually really intelligent person who can deal with details needs to get what you're saying. Okay, moving on. So this guy, Stephen Grossman, says, Popper's a nihilist. So we're back to just sort of... There's been, over 50,000 words talking about Popper not being a nihilist. And then he's just going to very introductory, high-level accusations that have nothing to do with the details of what we've been talking about for the last week or two, or however long it's been. Popperians don't claim looking for similarities and differences, patterns, as how you form concepts or learn. Okay, so I'm trying to explain my position. He says this is the Kantian rejection of the Greek discovery of mind. So, Kant does not have the position I have. I haven't actually read Kant, well, not very much, because I don't like it. But from what I've gathered, I've never heard Kant and evolutionary epistemology go together. For example, there's massive differences between what I'm saying and what Kant said. And by the way, from what I have read of Kant, as well as secondary sources, he's completely terrible. The only reason I read a bit is I wanted to check it myself. And yeah, I found it awful, I didn't like it, so I didn't read much. There are plenty of bad thinkers that I've read quite a bit of, because I wanted to know for myself more about them, but they're usually better than Kant. Like, I don't read, like, Hegel or Heidegger either, but I'll read someone more like Hayek or Rothbard a bit. Not a ton because I don't like them, but I'll read some of their stuff, and it's not nearly as bad as Kant, and it's more interesting to me, and then I can see why they're wrong. And they're more interesting because there are decent people who have a high opinion of Hayek. There are decent people who are confused about him and have misunderstand him. And there's people who have pretty decent views about capitalism, and then they say, "Oh, Hayek is pretty great. I learned about capitalism from him." And it's interesting to me because part of what they're saying contradicts Hayek. Because they're actually like better capitalists. Some of the people who like Hayek are better capitalists than Hayek was, and I find that kind of strange and interesting. So it motivated me to read Fatal Conceit and Constitution of Liberty, even though at that point I already disliked Hayek. Because I wanted to see sort of what people were reading, why they thought he was good. Whereas with Kant, I haven't run into people who like Kant and are actually appealing in some way or seem to have some good points to them. Like the Hayek fans, some of them like capitalism and do know some economics. Some of them like Mises also. Some of them like Rand also. Whereas I don't know any Kantians who I have anything good to say about that would get me interested in reading Kant. And I don't know any supposed achievements of Kant that sound like interesting or valuable to read about. Whereas with Hayek, there are claims about Hayek's accomplishments that, if they were true, would actually be interesting and worth reading. Like, they're somewhat plausible claims if you haven't checked Hayek yourself, that, for example, Mises's economic calculation argument was incomplete, or, pretty good but didn't deal with everything, and that Hayek added to it and made it better. That is a claim that would be hard to know the answer to without reading either Hayek to check it yourself, or finding the right secondary sources, which can be hard when you don't know which side to agree with, or it can be easier to sort it out by looking at the primary sources. But with Kant, I haven't run into an issue like that, where I wanted to sort out and had to check Kant. Well, not very many. There was something that I read a bit of Kant about, but I forgot what it was offhand. Anyway, okay. This is very also underexplained. So he's adding a lot of complexity. Like, he's bringing up Kant, which is a whole big topic. And he's doing that unnecessarily. Like, I reject Kant. I don't like Kant. I'm not getting any of my ideas from Kant. I find Kant, like, unreadably bad. And then he's bringing up Greece. I like Greece. I read stuff about Greece. I'm reading Greek Ways by Bruce Thornton currently. And I've read a lot of stuff about the pre-Socratics. Popper writes about the pre-Socratics. Popper has a book called The World of Parmenides, which it's one of my favorite Popper books. It's not the most important, but I particularly like it. And it talks about Parmenides, Xenophanes, Thales, Heraclitus, Anaximander, Anaxagoras, people like that. And Popper learned ancient Greek so that he could deal with primary sources and do some of his own translations. And he has a better method than some of the other translators who are bad philosophers. And he's able to make some improved translations of some important passages because he's a better thinker than his rivals. And it's really interesting how he does it. And he provides a lot of details. Some of that's in Open Society, and maybe some of his other books too. But there's a bunch of interesting stuff in The World of Parmenides. Part of what Popper does is he says, okay, these people thought they were saying something important. And the fragments we have from the pre-Socratics they're basically things that someone else also thought was important and quoted in writing, and that's what got preserved, was being quoted by someone else. So it wasn't just, I think my idea is important, but other people actually agreed it was important at the time, so much so that they wrote it down and quoted from it. And in that context, when you have a translation of some ancient Greek philosophical idea that makes it boring and stupid and not something that would have impressed people at the time because even the ancient Greeks would have known it was wrong or not seen value in it, then you're translating wrong. That doesn't make sense. You need to translate it in such a way that you can also come up with a story about why they thought it was right at the time, why they thought it was important. Some story about how it fits into the ancient Greek society that actually makes sense. Anyway, that's one of his methods that helps him translate Greek better than other people. And I've checked some of this stuff myself, by the way. I don't know Greek, but I've read many different translations of the same passages and compared them to Popper's to get, what information I can on what are the different interpretations from different scholars. And I've seen that Popper's a better translator in cases where I've done a bunch of comparisons. But Popper also provides the alternative ideas in some cases and presents, this is what the other translator said, this is why, this is what I think. He does a good job of not just presenting his own ideas, but presenting rival ideas and how he compares to them, sometimes. Anyway, I'm not rejecting the mind. I'm just saying that you don't learn in this particular way. And he comes to the conclusion that I'm rejecting the mind when I'm rejecting one theory of mind. So now he's saying that evolution is mystical. No, that's not very fair. But somehow evolutionary epistemology is mystical. Something beyond the mind causes knowledge. What? He thinks that evolution is a mystical force, or something that's like causing knowledge. Whereas that's completely the wrong perspective on evolution. Evolution is, there are certain processes that create knowledge, and evolution is our name for a category of process. So evolution is not a force in the universe. Evolution is not like a god that does something. It's the physical process that does something, and there's a reason why, and we call it evolution and explain how it works. Mind, however, is volitional. I agree, that is compatible. Like, you can volitionally do evolution. And some of it's done subconsciously, but there's still volition involved. Its own self-caused actions and focusing on reality cause knowledge. So he's calling me mystical, but this is so vague. It's very hard for me to know if we're agreeing or not because I don't know what he means when he says objectively and subjectively in this particular sentence. I very much hope he defines his terms, but my recollection from when I read this before is that he's not going to, so. I agree we focus on reality. I don't think consciousness is split from reality. I don't think focusing on reality causes theory as an explanation of learning. It's not like you choose to focus on reality and then you learn. That doesn't say how you learn. Focus in what ways? It's not just like you focus and then you learn automatically. There's more to it than that. Not even induction claims you just focus and then learning happens. Induction claims there's a whole process. HB writes about concept formation, axioms, finding similarities, these different steps and things you do that are more elaborate and more specific than just focus onto reality. Theory is an abstraction from observation. So this is an inductivist claim. That's standard inductivist thinking. So he's asserting induction to me, which is not a productive thing to do. I'm familiar with induction. I'm familiar with both positions. He's not familiar with my position, and he's just repeating claims for his position that I already have, refuted many years ago, and then won dozens of debates about. People tend to assume that the person they're arguing with, the problem is the other person doesn't know the stuff that they do know. They just think the other person's more ignorant than me, and if I just tell him the great stuff I know, he'll come around. And that is a bad approach to discussion because it's not very good for learning things yourself. It's a little bit pointless, and it's in the case where the other person happens to know something you don't, it's rather bad for finding out. If you're just sort of assuming everyone's below you and not listening to them much. It's not just condescending, but you're missing opportunities. Unless you're like the best person in the world, you're going to be missing opportunities. It's better in a discussion to treat people more like a peer and to not presuppose that you're right or they're right, and to try to look at things objectively. And I don't think he realizes how just reasserting his position that I'm already familiar with is not a productive thing to do with a peer who already knows your position. implicit in his approach to discussion is the assumption that basically I don't know what I'm talking about and I don't understand objectivism. And that this Popper stuff has nothing to it. And he's assuming that even though he has not studied Popper, whereas I have studied both Popper and Rand. And I'm not trying to assume people I talk to are ignorant. It's, he's not even claiming to have studied Popper. HB only read, I think he said 110 pages of Logic of Scientific Discovery. So he doesn't know much about Popper. And from talking to the other people, no one has actually claimed to have extensively studied Popper, and I've seen no signs that anyone has. A few of them have read like a few Popper books, but not gotten very far with like methodical study and chewing it and understanding it and so on. And anyways, even if they did study Popper a lot, if they don't understand my reading of Popper, my takeaways from Popper, then it doesn't really matter. Unless they actually know the position that I'm talking about, then they shouldn't just assume it's wrong. Theory is not rationalized subjectively. Downloaded from Gatto. So this is strange. Like, if you downloaded your theory from God, like God just sort of stuck it in your head, that wouldn't be subjective. That wouldn't be a subjectivity issue. That would be more like authoritarianism. You'd have issues with dogmatism because God just sort of gave you the truth. And why does he put evolution on that list? Like, downloaded from evolution? Because he's treating evolution as like a force of nature or something, rather than a human label on a physical process. And you need a word for the concept, and then it's not a force; it's a description. I find it's not like weird or surprising, but it's very unfortunate that people are very intolerant of those who don't accept evolution. Most people are like, oh my god, you have to accept evolution. But the vast majority of people who accept evolution are very, very confused about what it is, and they don't really understand much about it. And the concept of evolution that most people have is so bad and misconceived and confused that it's actually reasonable for a lot of people to say, that doesn't actually make sense to me, I'm not sure about this evolution thing. Like, the proper understanding of evolution is something, it's a very sophisticated, advanced theory. It's scientific, people ought to accept it. It's very logical and precise and whatever. But the actual sort of common knowledge of evolution, which is what some people, like what gets taught in high school. The thing taught in high school is much, much worse than the real theory of evolution. So it becomes understandable that some people don't accept it, and not very sympathetic that some people are very intolerant of anyone who doesn't accept it, because the theory taught in high school is kind of dumb and incomplete and confused. And it's like, why are people accepting it and then saying everyone has to accept it when people are so confused about what evolution is? Okay, he says, observation is wrong, with nothing to make the experience more or less pleasant. So this is another assertion. We directly, immediately see reality, the pleasant and the unpleasant parts. Another assertion. And it's like, what about photons? Photons have travel time. When he says immediately, he is literally wrong. Like, he's just contradicting basic science here. Or he's being very careless and sloppy. Rationalized subjectivity may intentionally distract us from observation and even, if sufficiently habitual, cause a psychological mind-reality split, schizophrenia. Don't know why he's bringing up mental illness. My thread on mental illness was closed without people answering it. No one has been able to do things like point to some drug science that says lithium works. I actually got a reply saying basically it's so obvious that lithium works that it's practically direct perception, and you should just skip science because you already know the answer, so don't bother with science. Which I found kind of amazing. It's not that amazing in our culture, but it's very unfortunate that people think that way. And just sort of think, they're very unaware of like bias, and that you need things like double blind. You don't just look and then know the answer. It's very naive. Okay, so rationalized subjectivity. He uses fancy terms and words and stuff, but I don't know what he means. Subjectivity is like one of those words that you really have to be clear about what you're trying to say if you want to use it, or else it's going to lead to a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding. It's a word that's like misused a lot, and it can be very hard to follow what people actually mean by it. And it's not just misused a lot, like, it's hard to decide like what the correct meaning is. It's sort of an unclear word in English. I think it has like multiple meanings that are reasonable ways to use it. And people usually don't clarify which one they mean very well. Rationalized subjectivity may intentionally distract us. So subjectivity may distract. Subjectivity is the object here. Rationalized is a qualifier. Subjectivity is a noun. And then subjectivity may distract. Intentionally is an adverb. It's a qualifier on distract. Rationalized says which type of subjectivity. Intentionally says which type of distraction. And the actual core meaning here is subjectivity may distract. So he's treating subjectivity as an active actor that's doing something. Subjectivity is verbing here. Subjectivity is taking an action to distract us. So subjectivity, as distinct from us, is distracting us. Presumably he really means this in an individualized way, so I would figure what he means is more like my subjectivity may distract me, or your subjectivity may distract you. I don't think he means in a collective way like our subjectivity may distract us, because it's not like his subjectivity is distracting me. But anyways, so subjectivity is distracting people, so subjectivity is like a sort of force of nature like he thinks evolution is. It's like doing things, that's a causal actor, which is very bizarre. Like, I don't think I've run into that concept of subjectivity before, where it's like basically a person in its own right that's acting to confuse and distract people. It's like, it's really humanizing, like, flaws, like many people. It's strange. And he's also attributing intentionality to subjectivity. Now, it's possible he's just a bad writer and he means something else, but... Alright, so, if sufficiently habitual... Alright, we're just going to move on. I'm not going to worry about schizophrenia. If you want to know about schizophrenia, read Thomas Saw's book, Schizophrenia, the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry. Look out at reality. The I Ching, just kidding. So, making jokes is a really bad idea when people are culturally kind of dissimilar and are having miscommunications and misunderstanding. It is not plausible, it should not be plausible from his perspective that I will get his joke. It's just going to be like, I'm lost. Like, why would he reasonably expect me to get his joke? He doesn't know, like, what walk of life I'm from, what references I'm going to get, what my sense of humor is. We're not on the same page enough to be making jokes to each other. Presumably he wrote it not to be productive, but because he likes the joke. Maybe he thinks some of the audience will like the joke. Maybe they will. But as far as talking to me, it's just a bad idea. So I will ignore it. It doesn't matter. Okay, identify your context of knowledge, contra Hume. This is, within that, only rational hypothesis, and those which have some evidence. Which ones have some evidence? Which ones have how much probability? How do you decide from evidence how much probability an idea has? These are basic questions that I believe I've already asked, but I think people have had trouble understanding them, so I think I should just ask them again. Now he's talking about the Grateful Dead. It's more... He doesn't have a good sense that we're different people. We have different perspectives, and he should try to say sort of neutral, clear things, rather than stick to his own world. He's not doing really anything to bridge the gap from him to me. He's just talking his own way about things he cares about, like the Grateful Dead, and about Thomas Edison, and about I Ching. Like, even rolling up your sleeves, like, that one's much more common, so it's reasonable that I'd be familiar with it, but it's... While I am familiar with it, it's certainly not something that I would insert into an epistemology discussion. It doesn't play a role in my epistemology perspective, and being precise, I don't think it plays one in his either. I think he's just sort of talking in a somewhat careless way. He's talking about, like, coffee and donuts. he's being sort of jovial, and he's talking like he talked to a friend, but he's not understanding that I'm not his friend. Not that I dislike him or anything, but we're not similar people. We don't have the stuff in common that he has in common with his friends. Maybe we have some of it in common. I do like donuts. Well, not coffee, but yes to donuts. But he doesn't know me, and he's talking like he's talking to a friend that he does know. And, now he's bringing up Thomas Edison. We don't need to bring up extra things. He did 10,000 experiments. I don't know how many experiments Thomas Edison did. I have not studied Thomas Edison. I haven't read a biography of Edison. It's not one of the things that I'm very familiar with. So I actually don't know offhand. Is 10,000 like an actual reasonable estimate of how many experiments he did? Or did he do like 500 experiments and it's just being exaggerated? Or maybe he did 30,000 experiments and it's just a very rough number because the actual number's not important. I don't know. It depends a lot on what counts as one experiment. Like if you redo the same experiment twice, does that count as 2 or 1? If you make a very tiny change and redo it, is that 2 or 1? If you're counting things as separate experiments. And what if you do a multi-part experiment? What counts as a 3-part experiment versus 3 experiments? Anyway, depending on how you count those things, you could inflate the number to a very large number. You could probably, depending on how you count them, get him over 100,000. But also, if you count them in a very conservative way that's going to get you a low number, then maybe you could get it down under 100. I don't know how many very, very clearly distinct different experiments he worked on. Like if you're like, oh, the stuff with the lightning and the kite and electricity, that's like one experiment. And maybe you can make like months of work count as one experiment and get a low number. So not only am I not familiar enough to actually know the right amount very well, it's also, even if I was, I wouldn't know if I agreed with him or not because it depends how this guy's counting experiments. It's a tricky issue. And it's not necessary to bring up. There's no real reason to bring this up. He's not doing anything important to the discussion with it. Why is he calling light bulbs practical? Like, what is this adding to the discussion? How is that relevant? I agree light bulbs are practical. But why are we talking about it? Alright, anyway, opportunity is missed by most people because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work. So basically he's saying thinking takes work. This does not answer the logical problem of what work do you do to think? What steps does thinking involve? If you're willing to put in a bunch of work to think, okay, but how do you do it? What do you do? That's what epistemology is about. And he's just completely punting on that. He has no answers. He presupposes that you're intelligent and that you know how to think. And then he's just like, do it. It's like, okay, but then what's the point of your epistemology? His epistemology is more like incomplete tips that are somewhat useful for thinking adults. That is somewhat useful and may help him in his life, but it is not epistemology. Or at least it's certainly not fundamental epistemology, to give, an incomplete set of life tips for adults who already know how to think. If you're not saying how to think, you're not dealing with the epistemology fundamentals. My normal process for writing is a lot like this. Like, I know all this stuff, I think about these things, but I do it more quickly. It takes a lot longer to explain it out loud. So I'll read a post, I'll have thoughts like these, and then I'll write a reply. And the reply will have a very small fraction of what I know in it. Replies are very selective. I can talk for 80 minutes or more about these things, and then write a post that is a few hundred words and can be read very, very quickly. So the site was down earlier. Let's see if it's back up. Oh, it is back. Okay, good. That means it's possible for me to actually reply on the site. So I'll refresh this page. All right. So I'm going to reply to this one first because it's going to be quick and easy. But what I want to do is get my text editor. And do I want to use a quote? I'm going to be the next post right after him. Oh, it wasn't this one, was it? Was it? No, it is this one. This is the one with the part. All right. It's the part about some evidence that I wanted, and the part about probability. All right. I'm going to split this up. Right. That's basically what I wanted to say. I don't want to write a long reply for this anyways. This is fine. Alright. Copy. The unfortunate thing is you lose quotes when you copy paste in text. I tried other text editors besides Lightpaper, like Pages, and I did not find a way of doing quotes in any text editor that would copy paste in. Maybe Microsoft Word would work, I didn't try that one. So I have to manually add the quotes back in order to write in my own text editor, which is important. Because web forms are not a good place to write. And you're missing various hotkeys and control over your writing and formatting and stuff. Sometimes I write short posts in here, but it's overall not a very good writing space compared to my own tools. Plus, if I write in here, then I have to get my own copy of it, I have to copy paste it from here, which loses quotes. When I copy paste this or this out, I would lose quoting. So I'd still have to manually fix quotes. And when I copy paste this into like a plain text box, I also lose formatting, like italics. So if I take this and then I go put it in my comments, the italics are gone. This is just plain text. No italics, no bold. However, I can take this and I can copy this onto my blog without any edits because it's already in Markdown format and it works fine. I've been copying most of my posts over to my blog and just putting them in comments here because I want to have the comment, I want to have my own content in public and I want to have my own copy of it. And I want my own stuff to be discussable by people who aren't HBL members. Like, it's fine that HBL is a private forum, or a semi-private forum, that not everyone's a member of. But for my own writing, I do want the public to have access. And I want things like permalinks. In a later discussion, if I decide this is a good answer, I want to reuse it, I can click here, get the permanent link to it, and then I can give someone this link. And I can't do that. I can't just use a link to the HBL forum in a random discussion somewhere else because people will click on it and they won't be able to see what I wrote. Whereas if I give them this link, then they can see what I wrote. I also don't trust the links on the HBL site to never ever change. It's possible they will update the forum software one day and then the links will be different. Whereas I can control that this link never changes. curie.us/comments/show/7431. I can make sure that always works. Even if I change my software, I'll keep it so that will redirect to the right place. Which is important because I like to use links and have them work forever instead of breaking after a while. And also on the HBL site, links to individual posts were not reliably working in my experience, in my testing. Whereas on my site, linking to a specific comment works fine. Like you can click this one and now it has the box around it, and it scrolls on the page straight to it. And if that ever breaks, I will fix it. If modern browsers change in such a way that it no longer works and you have to code it in a different way, I'll be able to fix it. But currently it works. And I will keep it working, so that's important. And that I can reference this. Oh, I didn't write a one-line summary. Okay. Now I want to reply to HB. Alright, done with that. I don't have to save it on my computer because I've got it on my blog comments, which is backed up to my computer anyways. So I don't worry about saving the posts individually. If I wasn't putting them in my blog comments, then I need to save them in text files, basically. Well, the blog comments saves them for me. Okay, so this was hard to reply to. There were so many issues. Let's try doing details. Okay. Like, he didn't explain how it's primacy of consciousness. Alright, I'm going to ignore Helen Keller, but I'll get these parts. A lot of my posts I haven't done heavy quoting because it's not the sort of standard way the forum works. And it's not great for audiences, I don't think, but we're misunderstanding each other, and I think it's important to sometimes go into details like this. So rather than do a high-level overview of my position, which hasn't been working, I'm going to try doing some very detailed replies, which I haven't done a lot of. So concepts are formed from perception. Let's do more. He used raw here, but it wasn't here. So first he says concepts are formed from perception, but now he's saying raw observation. Okay. All right. One thing left. Okay. Let's see if he uses the word raw here. Only twice with spaces around it. The raw data of introspection is understood as included in perception that both are direct preconceptual awareness. This is just the kind of thing I disagree with, because you need concepts already to decide what to look at. If you don't have any concepts, then when you look, there's just all these infinities and you have no idea what to look at. You need concepts to guide you. And it's not just the infinities, but the, like you get a lot of sensory data, and it would be overwhelming, even if it's not infinite. Like, the amount of different, like, color pixels you see in front of you per second. If you're getting, like, 50 million different pixels worth of vision resolution, and each pixel has, that's just, like, thousands of values of different colors they could be that you can differentiate, and you're getting 60 frames per second, or no, human eyes aren't 60. Let's just call it 20. I think it's more like 20. What is? I forgot how many frames per second we see. But let's just say 20 frames per second, like thousands of colors, millions of pixels. That's like a massive, massive amount of information. Without any concepts to organize it or decide what's important, you're not going to get anywhere. Anyway, let's Is there a different way to search for raw? If we just search it, how many do we have? That's not that many. It just keeps being draw. He uses the word draw a lot. We're long past chapter 2 now, anyways, which is the one about perception. So I'm just going to stop searching there. Anyway, so the reason I was checking is I wanted to see if he said what raw perception or raw observation is before I replied. Weren't there two? Did I only look at one? I looked at this one. What's this? Oh, this one said raw assertion, which is not relevant. Okay. So what do you think the difference between... Okay. Now, we need to copy all text formatted. So the good news is that my italics are carrying over. Links also work in bold, but not underlines and not quotes. Also, the hotkeys on this forum don't work. So I can hotkey bold and italics and underline, and I can link with Control-K, which is not what the help stuff says. I don't know why it's Control-K, but Control-K lets me link stuff. However, there's no hotkey for block quote that I can find, which is very unfortunate. So I have to be careful when I do this because I don't want to quote the wrong stuff. It's kind of unfortunate. Here, it helps if I get the if I pull up a proper preview. See, then we make this nice and big. Then we match. So serious, as stated, concepts. If it is impossible, yeah, that. We don't perceive everything. Okay. This whole routine. Another thing I don't know how to do on this form is nested quotes, because if you go into a quote, and then you click quote again, it just unquotes it. But sometimes people post nested quotes, I'm not sure what they're doing. Okay. So the reminded of Quinn's. Even for adults. Tables have a zillion characteristics. Yeah. It's not important. It's sort of important whether it's infinite, but like for purposes of our discussion, a zillion is fine. For now. Okay, so now I've quoted added in the quotes. I need a one-line summary. It's hard to do a summary because I replied to each individual thing rather than deciding, okay, here's my point, I want to talk about this, and writing one of my ideas. This is just, it's very responsive to each of the different things he said, so it doesn't have like a clear theme. I was just responding point by point. So I will just say point by point reply. There we go, summarized. Alright, now we're going to submit it and post it onto my blog here. Just comment. I could have put the topic into the summary, like point by point reply about perception and observation and infinities and logical problems, you know? Maybe that would have been better, but I didn't. So this was the induction thread. And now I've answered that one. Mistakes of Karl Popper has a new reply. This is another one I wanted to reply to. So I disagreed with a lot of things in chapter 2. I could go through it and point things out that I disagree with. He says this is an error, but it's like factually and literally true, and it's basic science. Also the way he quotes, like, he says, quote, that very error. But what does the word that refer to? Presumably it refers to my first sentence of the quote, but not the second sentence. I do call it that myself. Still, it's... I think it's poor writing. When you have a lot of misunderstandings, it's better to use a meaningful word instead of that. Even if it's more wordy, for extra clarity. I don't have a criticism of it. That's how. It is the best explanation of the evidence. There's no alternative explanation with no real world, which fits the evidence and stands up to criticism. And there's no criticism of... So there is criticism of no real world, and there's no criticism of real world. And if you want details on that, you should really, really read The Fabric of Reality, which addresses solipsism. And it does not address it in an objectivist way. It's a Popperian book. David is you'd call him an Ayn Rand fan, but not an objectivist, not a careful studier of objectivist epistemology, more the kind of person who reads Rand and likes a bunch of parts, anti-altruism, likes capitalism, stuff like that. But definitely not a fan of objectivist epistemology. He more or less said, oh, this is induction, it's just like all the other inductivists. It is refuted by my arguments against induction, and there's no value there. And I agree with part of that. It is inductivist, and the induction stuff is wrong, and it is... Our pre-existing arguments do refute objectivism's version of induction. However, I disagree about the lack of value. I think there's interesting stuff in objectivist epistemology other than the inductivist mistakes. I think it's worth studying, despite being inductivist. And also, the rest of Rand is very, very, very worth studying, and David did not study it enough, and that's a mistake he made. But regardless, the points are, David is a mild Ayn Rand fan, and his book is a Popperian book that answers solipsism without using objectivist thinking. It answers it another way. I could summarize what David says about solipsism in the book, but it's really better if you just read the book. Because it's not like there's just one standalone argument. It's more of a complete system. And solipsism is actually a theme that comes up throughout the book. It's one of the actually heavily indexed words that comes up on many different pages. So there's a refutation of it, but it's also the way of thinking about it is used in a positive way in understanding the correct way to think about the world repeatedly. So it's a theme rather than just a self-contained, like, logical trick or something. It's not just this one clever trick about refuting solipsism, it's that our whole philosophy and perspective and way of thinking addresses solipsism. And also, part of my perspective is, if someone is not willing to read David Deutsch's 2 books, they're never going to understand critical rationalism. It's pretty damn hopeless. Understanding complex philosophies takes a hell of a lot more effort than reading 2 books. Which leads to various issues of, like, what sort of preview should I give? So I end up writing about things that are interesting to me that I think ought to be enticing to people, like, here are logical problems with your view, here's the outline of a different view. But if you want, the full details of the different view, your study of the matter should involve not just talking to me, but also reading a few books. Especially David's. If someone read David's books very carefully and talked with me, they might be able to get away with not really reading much Popper. I still think one could benefit from Popper, but it's rather less necessary than David's books, because David comes later and has a more organized, better way of presenting it. With Popper also, there's key passages and chapters that are very, very highly recommended, rather than complete books. The quality of Popper is more hit or miss. Like, this chapter is really good, and then this next chapter is okay, and this next chapter is not super important. And so it's very valuable to read the right chapters from Popper, which is, all the people who hate Popper have not read the right chapters. They go read, like, Logic of Scientific Discovery, and then they don't like it. And then they miss all the value. When they should be reading, like, Realism and the Aim of Science, chapter 1, and Conjectures and Reputations, like the first 5 chapters or so, and reading Objective Knowledge. I forget which chapters in Objective Knowledge. It might be like 1 to 3, but it might be some of the later ones. And that's not how people normally read Popper. And this is partly Popper's fault. Like, he should have published, like, a very short thing saying, read this part of my work. But he didn't know which parts of his work were more and less important very well. He wasn't aware of his own, like, mistakes, and I mean, he was aware of mistakes. Like, he talks about ways he was misunderstood in his later writing, and says, I've now understood, like, these various ways I was misunderstood, and here's a better way to explain it. But then, like, he doesn't have, like, a guide for a new reader that says, like, don't read Logic of Scientific Discovery unless you've already read 5 other Popper books. Well, that was a bit of a tangent. So, appearances are not internal objects. Those are separate things. He may well be correct that a lot of philosophers have mixed them up and used them as synonyms or something. So there may be a terminology issue here, and it may be my fault for not having read all the bad philosophers that HB has read. I've focused pretty selectively on philosophers I think are good, and read bad philosophers in more limited amounts. But I've read, like, a lot of the philosophers I actually like. Rand, Popper, Godwin, Deutsch, Burke, Sawes, Feynman. And much more limited quantities of philosophers I don't like, because they're boring and dumb. And I only read them when I have a purpose, and then I read selectively for the purpose, generally. That's the general approach, is, like, I don't just read Locke straight through. I would only have something I was curious about, like, I want to know what Locke says about this, and then I'd go find it and read that part. Or I want to know how good Locke is, so I'll just read some until I see, like, oh, he keeps messing up, or oh, this is good. Just, like, get a sense of quality. I do things like that. I read Locke a long time ago. I read his book about education. Well, not the whole thing. I forget if it was, like, a book or a long essay or whatever, but I read, like, 50 pages or whatever of the start of his On Education, I think it was called. Or, yeah. And it was very, very bad. It was very anti-liberal. So I was like, oh, people think Locke is this great liberal, and then he has a very anti-liberal perspective on children, which to me indicates, like, a lack of understanding of liberal principles. And you don't see that in better liberals. I've never run into anything in Burke that says awful stuff about children. I've never run into anything in Popper saying awful stuff about children. Rand has very good things to say about children. I really appreciate, like, the Comperticos. I don't agree with Montessori in particular, but, like, Rand's broad general perspective on children is good. She says some really good things. She has some insight there, rather than just being sort of a typical person who's awful to children. Whereas Locke's take on children is, he thinks he's very clever and insightful by saying, if you beat them when they're young, and you break their spirits young, you won't have to beat them as much. He's basically saying it's easier to break their spirit when they're 2 than when they're 5. If you, like, wait until they're 5 and you're trying to be nice and you don't beat them up when they're 2, then you're actually just going to have to beat them, like, more times and harder when they're 5 in order to break their spirit. So it's better to just break their spirit really young with a lower number of beatings. That is Locke's great insight into education that I was very, very not happy with. It impressed a lot of other people, though, because people are big on beating children, and that is another topic I won't go into. Okay, here's my last post. I read everything above this before. I think. I didn't reply to it all, though. What was this? Oh, yeah, this. I definitely read that. Okay, he blames me for not understanding, and he argues with Ed. Whatever. This post was not very nice. Try objectivism. Okay, I have. And then, like, I'm making a very basic point here. Like, some people need glasses. I'm right. Just accept it, please. Why are we arguing about this? Inaccurate in what context? The context of, like, seeing what's really there as opposed to... So, I have a real example, because I wear glasses, and I didn't always wear glasses, and there's a time period when I kind of needed glasses, but I didn't realize it, because my eyes were only, like, a little bit bad. And this caused some actual confusion about what things look like. In particular, street lights at night would sort of spike out and look sort of distort. You get, like, a big sort of diamond-shapey thing. Not a diamond, but like a cross, kind of. So, like there's the place where the street light actually is that the light's coming from, but then you see, like, sort of streaks coming out from it of extra light. And so after, like, seeing the world that way for years without realizing I needed glasses, I didn't actually remember that, like, streetlights weren't supposed to look like that. Like, I didn't realize I was seeing them wrong, and that it was a problem with my eyes. I thought it was just sort of like they look weird or something. I don't know. I mean, I didn't think about it much. But then once I got glasses, then I looked at streetlights through glasses, and I was like, oh yeah, that makes way more sense. But I hadn't realized, I didn't understand the inaccuracy very well at the time. Which is common, by the way. Like, there are people in school who cannot see the blackboard very well. And this is not always figured out. Sometimes people just think they're stupid, and they don't know that the other kids can see better. Because they can't compare to how well the other kids see. They just get called stupid and bad at reading and stuff like that, when it's actually a vision issue. And there's also kids in school with hearing issues who get called stupid and bad at listening when they're actually having trouble hearing. Because it's not obvious that they're perceiving, like, differently than the other people, or wrong or anything. And it doesn't stop them from learning anything, but it sure makes it harder, and there can be plenty of confusion about it. Anyway, objectivity is the alternative to mysticism and subjectivism. I agree with that sentence as written. Partially blind people see light. Yes, like, so what? Objectivists should respect the hierarchy of knowledge, starting with perception, even if their opponents don't. Okay. That is the standard objectivist position. And I found this sentence very interesting, because he's saying that we perceive causality. Not that we perceive dogs, not that we perceive rain, but that we perceive causality, like you observe causality. Causality is not a physical object, so how do eyes perceive it? Photons don't bounce off causality. He says induction would then be impossible. Okay, I agree with that. I don't know if I agree with his reasoning. I don't know why he's coming to this conclusion, but I do think induction is impossible. I don't know what post he's referring to. People here don't use links. Like, he's referring to some post, but he doesn't link to it. I don't know what post he means. He also doesn't quote it. You know, he could quote the argument he means, but I don't know what he's talking about. I could try to find it, but I don't care enough. Because he hasn't... I'm pretty sure that, you know, I already read it and wasn't impressed. And if I go read it again now, I still won't be impressed. And he didn't write some new information that would change my mind. So he says, don't grant the premise. Okay, but the premise is true. Like, you don't get to decide which premises to grant by which ones are convenient for your philosophical system. You don't get to decide which premises to grant by what conclusions you think they lead to. And if it leads to bad conclusions, don't grant the premise. That's not a rational way of thinking. You have to actually deal with, is this premise true or false? Don't argue higher level issues. Now that is, it's an approach. I don't have a strong problem with it. I don't think it's necessary to do it the way he's saying, but I also don't mind it. To not argue higher level issues until you deal with the lower level ones. I do agree there are fundamentals, so okay, you succeeded at that. Like, I've literally been using the word fundamental over and over, and I talk about things like the fundamentals of epistemology all the time, to try to differentiate things like what I've been calling like the fundamentals of how we know, like the actual steps involved, from higher level, more abstract issues like say the specific methods of science, as apart from the methods of thinking. Like what you do extra in science, like using experimental tests, is a less fundamental issue than how you think at all. Anyway, I've been differentiating that kind of thing. So I do talk about fundamentals. People don't listen super well. That's not the best way to say it, but there's most people do not read nearly as closely as I do, and they're not paying super close attention, and they're not tracking details as well as I do, and because he should already know that I've been saying that there are fundamentals. Like, I've been talking about fundamentals repeatedly. Like, we can just do it on this page. Like, the word fundamental comes up 16 times. Let's just go to the top. So here I say fundamental problems. And here I say fundamental epistemology. So I've already used it twice above on this page. I've used it a lot more times if we go over here. Like here, there's a fundamental problem in epistemology by me. Here, me again, fundamental. I think that's me again. See, I use it a lot. He hasn't been paying attention. And it's not like I'm just one of the obscure contributors. Like, the main focus of this discussion is comments between me and HB. So people should actually be paying attention to what I'm saying. It's not like there's very many other posts on my side that are and that I'm just sort of making the occasional comment. Like, I'm an actual focus of this discussion. So if he's going to participate and argue in the discussion, he's arguing with me, and he ought to be paying attention to what I'm saying. It's hard, but it's a skill, and it makes a big difference to getting things right. It's a skill I've worked on a lot to track discussions well, and quickly and cheaply and efficiently and easily. Anyway, I want to reply to some of this. I wanted to reply specifically to this thing about observing causality. Alright, that's good enough. It's a little redundant, but that's good when people aren't understanding you or listening very well. Alright, covered that. I wanted to reply to HB some. I'll do chapter 2 later, because it's already been 2 hours and 15 minutes, and I'm not even done with what I'm doing right now. There's a specific subhead he's interested in. I could look for that, I guess. How long is this section? Oh, it's kind of long. This is going to take a long time to answer. I'm not going to do it right now. Why does he say if you did read it? Like, he knows that I said I read it. Is he calling me a liar? Or does he think maybe I'm lying and it's worth an if? I don't say that I read stuff that I didn't read. I think maybe he's sort of skeptical because he thinks if only I read it, I would agree with him, I would see things his way or something, which is not a good perspective. It's extremely common that people read stuff and disagree with it, or misunderstand it. Like, I think people massively overestimate how effective someone reading a book is. It's super easy to read a book and miss the point. It's super easy to read a book and think some things in it were dumb and then deny the conclusions. Happens all the time. The vast majority of people who read a Rand book, like, they don't come away understanding objectivism. So when people say, like, they've read Rand, I don't spend my time denying it and being like, I don't know, did you really read Rand? Otherwise you wouldn't be saying this. I'm super willing to accept they did read Rand. If they're saying they read it, generally they did. People don't usually lie that they read some book. They do sometimes, but it's not like the common case. The much more common case, if someone actually says they read it, is they did read it, they didn't understand it, they disagreed with something. When you read a book, you have a lot of choices about what to pay attention to, what to focus on, what issues you think are important, what things you're looking for as you read along. Reading's like an opinionated process. You don't just read what's there. This mirrors what we've been saying about perception. Where you don't just perceive what's there. It's an opinionated process where you choose what to focus attention on. Anyway, reading a book with different attention focuses, different problems you're interested in, different questions you're looking for answers to, it's a very different experience. So one person will read it in one way and another will read it in another way. And they'll miss completely different aspects of the book that they're not looking for. And this is why one of the reasons rereading books is great, is because, like, you learn a new thing. You learn, aha, now I understand this premise. And then when you reread the book, you look for everywhere that premise got used, and you understand what the point is better and, like, how it's working better. Like, rather than denying the premise, you see how it actually works and leads to those later things. Whereas, like, the first time you read it, when you think the premise is false, you don't pay much attention to the things the premise implies, because you figure, the premise is false, these things are false. You don't have to do it that way, but that's typical. Like, you can say, even though this premise is false, I'm going to very, very carefully examine what it would imply. While people could do that, they usually don't. They usually, if they think a premise is false, then don't pay much attention to the implications. They don't have a lot of, like, willingness to entertain false premises and see where they lead in a methodical, organized, careful way that actually goes very far, deals with many details, has much substance. So what I want to say is that I will reply about Chapter 2 later. Because I do think that's a good thing to do. But then I wanted to reply to this other part. How do you know in your theory that we know the real world? The fabric of reality. Oh, what I wanted to say here was about criticism. I could give a brief statement of this. It's hard to, I don't think it'll be understood. Like, I know ways to say it briefly, but I don't think they'll be understood. It's really hard to say what the criticism of the world not being real is in a way that I think they'll understand, because they don't have the background knowledge that is involved in the particular arguments I want to make. But I feel like if I just write this, it's not, I don't think I've gotten the point across yet. Okay, this gets a little idea across. Alright, that should hopefully help. I need to get formatted text. One of the things is whenever I copy formatted text, I get an extra new line on the end, even though there wasn't one in my file. I don't know why. It's not important though. Okay. Quote this, and then, as has been pointed out, quote this. Alright, that should do it. I need a summary. Okay. post? I did end up summarizing some of the solipsism stuff. A little bit. Where is it? Oh, right. So why does HB act like a real person if he's not real? Why is he doing complex behavior, thinking ideas, etc.? That is that's coming from Fabric. If he reads Fabric, he'll see the fuller version of this argument. Okay, so I need to make a note to okay. I think I'm going to save this for later. Okay, here's my last post. I think I read from previous. Oh, I wrote some long stuff. Oh, here's Aaron Mentor. Okay. She's more humble than a bunch of these people. A lot of the people here think not only are they great objectivists who know all this stuff, but that like most people here are great objectivists who know all this stuff, which I'm deeply skeptical of. I've read all this before, I'm just skimming again to see what I wanted to reply to. Oh yeah, this guy keeps talking about certainty. I think. Maybe it was someone else. I found his post like very unclear in what his position is, because he wasn't defining some of the disputed terms like certainty. Right here. So, I don't know what Kant meant when he said this, because I haven't read Kant. So that's not helpful communication. Then Popper's response is to say we have all this great stuff without any need for certainty. Okay. How is this a resignation? What good would certainty do? What's missing from these things? And if you're going to say this, like, what do you mean by certainty? What do you think is missing? Describe it in other words. Because I think that the good part of what people mean by certainty is what Popper calls knowledge. We can have knowledge. And then the bad part of what people call certainty is infallibility, omniscience, which we can't have, but we don't need. And some people want things like, they want to be safe. They want to know that, they never have to think again about this issue. No one can ever call them out for being wrong. They figured it out, they're done. That's a paraphrase from Rand. I think it's an atlas, but it could be Fountainhead or something. I'm gonna find it. Pause. Alright, here's Atlas Shrugged. You remember, there's something about Reardon metal, like... It's not it. It's Taggart talking about Reardon metal and having to like decide if it's good or bad, and not wanting to have to deal with that pressure. safe is used too many times. I'll just skim while I'm like... It's not undoable to do 150. I'm not even positive that the word safe is used on the part I want, though. Oh, here's one. This isn't the one I was looking for. Like the safety and rest thing. Certainty gives people the chance to rest, the chance to stop worrying about it, that any fool could come along any day now without criticism. People don't want to have to always be relying on their mind and their critical arguments and their judgment, and have everything perpetually at risk that maybe someone could argue with it and they wouldn't know what to say back. And they might even have to change their mind. That scares people, that maybe. They don't want that maybe. They want the maybe to go away. No maybes, it's perfect, it's done, there's nothing more to be said. And then they can rest and feel safe. We'll be safe for the first time in centuries. Everyone will know his place and job, and everyone else's place and job. We won't be at the mercy of every stray crank with a new idea. Nobody will push us out of business, or steal our markets, or undersell us, or make us obsolete. Nobody will come offering some damn new gadget and putting us on the spot to decide whether we'll lose our shirt if we buy it, or we'll lose our shirt if we don't buy it, but someone else does. We won't have to decide. Nobody will be permitted to decide anything. This is the part I was looking for. It'll be decided once and for all. There's been enough invented already. Blast the ground from under our feet every few steps. Eternal uncertainty. Just because of a few restless, ambitious adventurers who keep criticizing things, questioning everything. Why should we let them question everything and have eternal uncertainty? Why can't we have a safe spot to rest? Why should we sacrifice our contentment for the greed of a few nonconformists? Just as we catch up, they're years ahead, the critical thinkers. The people who question their premises, instead of saying premises are unquestionable, and wanting to have safe premises to build on that they don't have to think about anymore. They're guaranteed. They want security for some of their premises. Don't say it in public. This is a good book. Anyway, yeah. I don't care about eternal uncertainty. I don't have this fear that James Taggart has. Alright, so I think this is the important part. I don't think anything else I should play this. Oh, God, my phone. I doesn't like all types of certainty. This guy is not paying attention to the facts of reality. Like, the left is not bringing in productive people. The left is actually keeping out productive people. The left is not bringing us free immigration for everyone. They're specifically bringing in third world poor people who aren't very smart and can be fooled into voting leftist. They're bringing in un-American people who don't value America on purpose. And they're keeping out a lot of people who would make great citizens. That's not the promotion of freedom. It's selective immigration according to the left's agenda, rather than free immigration. But he's not familiar with or following the actual issues, or at least he just ignores them or doesn't reply. Like, he doesn't seem to know what kind of thing I would say to this, and he doesn't preempt it and deal with it. Instead, he's just sort of sarcastic. And it's kind of mean. Like, he put more effort into making fun of me than into making useful comments about the issues. Like, he doesn't try to talk about what our immigration policy actually is. Who is being let in and why them? Who isn't being let in? He doesn't talk about what our policy is. He just uses the unstated assumption that our policy is free immigration, or that the left wants, like, freedom. But it's not like the left wants to take a bunch of immigrants from Western Europe. It's not like the left wants to let in a bunch of skilled Canadians. Immigration is limited, there's quotas. It's not free. It's just the left is trying to control who gets in and who doesn't in a particular way that suits them. But I wanna focus on epistemology. So I think I'm just gonna let that go. Or maybe I'll say something really short later. There's other ones like this one. Like, my point, Nate Silver is immoral. And then HB says, the New York Times seems to show similar results. What's your point? Is Nate Silver not immoral, or are his predictions good if they happen to match the New York Times in one case? Or is HB's point, he doesn't care if Nate Silver's immoral, he just cares about what's going to happen to the Senate? I wasn't talking about the Senate, so I don't know what's going to happen to the Senate. I don't know what a good prediction for the Senate is. I have not followed the Senate races, I've just followed the presidential race. I do not think that judging Nate Silver's motivations in psychology is, like, the right way to do this. I think that his, like, hardcore leftist affiliations matter, and you can't just trust him and treat him as an authority. And then if you want to go into details, you look at his actual claims and model, which I've done. And we could do that if someone wanted to do that and was actually going into detail, which I offered, but this reply is not going into those details. So I don't think analyzing this psychology thing here is the right way to look at it. Like, I didn't even say he was lying in this particular case. I said he's immoral, he's a liar, don't trust him. He might be right about this thing. He might be giving the right answer in this case, I don't know. I know that his models are not very good in general, but that doesn't mean he's wrong in this case. Anyways, this reply is sort of irrelevant to what I was saying. I get a lot of replies like that. They're hard to deal with. Like, because if you say, oh, your reply is irrelevant, and then you explain that. If you say your reply is irrelevant, they won't understand. They thought it was relevant. They wouldn't have replied like that if they didn't see some relevance. And then if you explain at length, so you could ask them, how is your reply relevant? And then you could reply to whatever they say, but that's kind of boring to people. It can be productive. Like, it's not a bad thing to do, but the audience doesn't like it, and most people don't like it, even if they're involved directly. Or you can guess why they think it's relevant, and you can preemptively say, here's like 10 reasons you might think it's relevant, but it's not. Or you can, like, repeat yourself a bunch and say, like, here's what I was actually talking about. None of those are great answers, though. Moving on. Let's see. I do not think that that is a useful contribution. I'm going to move on. Oh yeah, this guy. This guy said that I don't think of myself as an objectivist, which isn't true. So I contradicted that, and he said, in my view, one should only self-identify as an objectivist when one has substantial familiarity and agreement with Ayn Rand's philosophy. I agree, I have that. He's trying to imply I don't think I have that, but I do think I have that. So he's still commenting in a way that really makes implications about my own views. He's not just saying he thinks that I lack that. The implication here is that if he tells me this, I'll see for myself that I shouldn't think of myself as an objectivist, because I know I'm not substantially familiar, and I'm in substantial agreement. But that's not true. I think I am substantially familiar. I would bet money that I'm more familiar than he is. It'd be very hard to adjudicate, though. But, if there was a good way to adjudicate it, I'd be happy to bet money on it, without even really knowing anything about him. Just because I think the odds are in my favor. And I'd also be willing to bet that I agree with Ayn Rand's philosophy more than he does. Again, that's very hard to adjudicate. But I'd still be happy to do it if there was some way to. My disagreements on epistemology are substantial, but my agreement is very purist in a lot of other ways, in a lot of other areas. So that I've reliably found in discussions with people claiming to be objectivists that I think that they're way too impure, not actually taking Rand seriously in all sorts of ways. For example, a lot of people aren't big on pronouncing moral judgment. Like, Rand didn't just present an epistemology, she wrote an essay on pronouncing moral judgment. And I agree with that, and a lot of objectivists don't. I have no idea if this guy does, but it's a common example of something objectivists don't agree with. And it's not the only one. Like, I think that this quote right here is super important. And I've never seen other objectivists talk about it or notice it exists. And I've Googled for this, and I found no one talking about it. This is like one of my very favorite Ayn Rand quotes. This essay is amazing. And she talks about building sanctuaries for the best of the human species. No one pays attention to this. There's so many parts of objectivism that I think are really, really good and really, really important, and I basically never see other people talking about. Like regular objectivists who think they're these great objectivists, who totally agree with and understand Ayn Rand, they just ignore most of what she said. That's the way I think about it. And then here's another one. This is a super important quote, and most people do not pay much attention to this. You see people who think they're objectivists, and they try to get influence. They do all sorts of second-handed stuff to be influential, to get an audience in the wrong ways. That's very common. Then, here's another one. I think this quote is really good, and I don't see people talk about it much. And I've searched for people talking about it, and found very little. These are just 3 examples. Where's his blog post on underappreciated Rand quotes? Where's his review of We the Living? Maybe he has those things. Maybe he has a blog I haven't seen. But the odds are he doesn't. The majority of people saying things like he's saying would not have that stuff. And would not have studied objectivism nearly as much as I have. Most people just read a lot less than I do. Most people think if you take all the objectivist books and then you add up how many times they've read each one, you get a sum total. A lot of people think if they have 10 or 20, then they've very carefully studied objectivism, they're a great objectivist. They've, counting rereadings, they've read 10 or 20 books. They think that's super thorough, whereas I would think that that's not that much. And I've done a lot more reading than that. I think more like 50 is a better number than 10 or 20. That's a lot more study. Most people have not done 50 readings of objectivist books, or anything close. A lot of people have done 5 or 10 of the people who think they're good objectivists. And some might push up towards 20, especially older people. Anyway, I don't want to argue with him about it. I'm going to drop it. And I warned him in advance that I was going to drop it. So even though he's saying this sort of not very nice thing about you should stop identifying as an objectivist in your own mind because you're not substantially familiar and agreeing with Ayn Rand's philosophy. That's the implication. That's what he's trying to get at. Whereas, no, I think that I am familiar and I do agree with probably more than he does. it's a terrible like topic to argue about, though. It's not going to get anything useful done. It's just people aren't very nice and they're arrogant and whatever. I'm going to move on. Here, HB is trying to be picky, but he's mistaken. Or maybe there's a misunderstanding. I want to say something about this, and then I'm going to stop for now, I think. Okay, so like, he doesn't understand what I meant, or he doesn't understand the issue or something. So there is no point at which further information cannot be expected to change one's action decision. There's no point where you can ever say, I'm done, no matter what further information I got, I do not expect that it would change my action decision. The general case is, if you got enough further information, you would change your action decision. So you should always expect it. I'm not saying you would in every single case. Like, it might be that no matter what you knew, you'd still do the same thing. But the vast majority case is, if you knew more, you'd make a different decision. Now, he did not specify things like how much more, or whether it's an efficient use of resources to spend time trying to find out more about this right now compared to other things you could do. When you get into issues of resource use, then it's often a good idea to say, okay, I'm done with this, I'm gonna make this decision and I'm gonna move on. That's often a good choice in life where you have to worry about things like how much time it takes to get more information. And how much more information it might take before you make a better decision, and how much better the decision would be and whether it's worth it to put resources into it. When you get into that stuff, then you can make action decisions. But what he was saying was this very strong claim, where gaining more information can't be expected to change an action decision. He doesn't put any limit on how much information, and he doesn't say anything about the costs. So if you get unlimited information for free, my expectation is, in the majority of cases, it will change one's action decision. You'll be able to make a better decision with basically omniscience. There's no point where you're like, I'm done. Even if I was omniscient, I don't expect I would change my mind. That is not a reasonable thing to think. So maybe he thinks I'm being pedantic. Maybe he thinks I'm being literal. Maybe he thinks I should use common sense and know what he meant. That he only meant like a reasonable amount of more information that's like time efficient. I don't know, but I tend to be a bit literal, and so this is a reply. I'm not missing the point. I'm not changing words. I am saying a thing that is correct on its own terms that replies to a thing he said. Like, always may is the right words for my sentence. I wouldn't want to write, further information cannot be expected to change one's action decision. Or can be expected to. Well, okay, so if I wrote further information can be expected to change one's action decision, that would be fine. That would work. Maybe that would have been a better way to write it, actually, just to avoid misunderstandings, but it means the same thing. Like, word mirroring sometimes helps with communication, but as far as the content of what I'm saying, it's the same thing. Like, the reason, I'm trying to say the reason. Like, if I just said it can, then I would be contradicting him directly, and he would see that it was relevant. However, what I was trying to do was more talk about the reason, which is, you should always expect that further information could change your action decision, because it's not very clear. You need like the full quote. Okay. So yeah, I even talk about what I'm talking about. I say that you have to judge like whether the additional time is worth it. So it's like more information. You can always learn a new thing and change your mind. The question is whether it's worth the time or you should go do something else. Whereas he's saying like there's a specific point. At this point, information wouldn't. Okay. So I don't know how to do nested quotes. So I will do. Linear quotes. Oh, he has a bold on is. Don't want to lose his bold. Okay. I need to reread this whole paragraph. I'm saying that at a certain point it becomes irrational to have a certain expectation. So he's mistaken. If you had unlimited more information, you should expect that it will change your mind, not that it won't. When you define certainty in terms of reasonableness, then you have to say what reasonableness is. It's also like what type of doubt. There's contextual issues of what he means. But like this is too out of context. Beyond a reasonable doubt is not a good out of context criterion. The right thing is the stuff I talk about, which is you think about what problem am I trying to solve? What's my solution? Do I have any criticism whatsoever of this solution? If you have no criticism whatsoever, then you act on it. Things like, it would be better to spend more time on it and get a better solution because I don't have anything better to do. My time's cheap, or it'll be very expensive if I'm wrong, or whatever. It would be criticisms. If you have no criticism, you act on it. That's better than trying to judge whether you're beyond a reasonable doubt, whatever that means. It's better to do it in the Boolean way. Figure out precisely what your theory is that you're claiming is true. True, not false. Not lives up to some standard of reasonable doubt, but true, not false. Flawless. You want to have an idea you think is flawless. You should always act on flawless ideas. Okay. I think what I'm saying here is like very, very unobjectionable. So I'm sort of leaning towards some kind of misunderstanding, rather than him actually disagreeing with this. If he really disagrees, I'll be happy to talk about it. But I don't want to like try to explain something that's like really, really simple, and like belabor the point when it's not clear to me that he doesn't get it. Because like I haven't even mentioned yet that I have in mind unlimited new information. He probably just didn't have unlimited new information in mind. Like, because like I see gaining more information cannot. To me, that means no amount of new information would have the effect. But that's not how people normally talk. People normally talk in a really imprecise, non-literal way that I don't really understand. So I should come back to the rest later, but I'm not going to do it right now. This is going to be the end. Okay. Copy all text as formatted text. I need to hit reply. Right, reply. If this is right. And then we have 3 quotes up here. Because it's like if I go A, B, and then I quote them, and then I want to nested quote this, it just removes the quoting. And if I I copied a quoted thing and pasted it into a quote, hoping to get 2, but it didn't work. So I don't know how to do nested quoting. Okay. One-line summary. This is really just point-by-point replies of specific things. So I comment on flawless, I say his definition's unclear. Yeah, clarifying replies. Whatever. Alright, let me put this on my forum. No, it's like HB detail arguing. Detail clarifying. Yeah, that'll do. It's locked? Did my thing get posted? It looks like it got posted. I'm gonna load the page again. All of a sudden it's locked. I'm not pleased with it being locked. I wanted to keep discussing. I was totally planning to reply to like more of this stuff. What does locking mean? Like, do I just start a new topic and talk about the same things, or are the topics off limits now? I assume he'll say something about locking it. What's unquestionable? That's 4 things being locked. That is a lot. Oh, here's another one, 5. I wonder how he wants to handle it. Oh, he replied here. Let's see what he said. Maybe it says something about locking the topics. Gavaji nonsense. But I won't argue it here. Where will he argue it? We've reached the end. Oh, people are complaining, therefore we can't talk about it anymore. And I take it that he doesn't want to continue the discussion elsewhere. Because there's plenty of other forums where we could talk and then his customers wouldn't complain. But I don't think he wants to do that, because I don't think he's actually interested enough in the ideas to talk about them when it's not content for his forum. And he only wants to talk about it on his forum when it's content that pleases his audience. You know, if he's gonna, like, block threads, it should say that, like, on the site, that it's, you know, the site gives the impression that there's an unmoderated user forum where, like, abuse can be reported, but other than that, like, you can talk about whatever you want. There's no clear guidelines about what will be allowed or not. And there's no indication that threads will ever be closed for any reason. I don't like discussion forums where your conversations can just be closed in the middle and you don't know when this will happen or why in advance. You know, when it's not predictable. There was no way for me to predict that the thread was about to be closed. Like, here I was, actively in the middle of writing replies. You know, making this video. And then meanwhile, he was locking the thread. He was deciding not to reply in a serious way. Like, here I wrote out these point-by-point details because he wasn't getting my point. And he's not replying in a way that, like, really engages with what I was saying. If he wanted to say, like, where he would argue it, he would have. He doesn't want to. Like, that's my takeaway. I don't think people say, I won't argue it here, when they actually want to argue it somewhere else. He probably means something more like, if it somehow came up in some other forum, I might argue it at that time. But he's not, like, looking to bring it up immediately at another forum right now. Well, I'm gonna post this video, regardless of threads being locked. I will make a new thread if I have to, but it looks like the induction thread is still open at the moment. But it's gonna take a while to edit the video and stuff, and post it. But anyways, I'll definitely post the video, but other than that, it might be the end of the discussion. So I will stop here, and I will for the moment, my plan is only to continue with stuff that's in progress, which at this point is the video. So I'll finish the video, I'll post the video, but there might not be more discussion, which is really lame. Because these are important topics, you know? Very important. Hey, what happened to my review? I posted a review of Ayn Rand Contra Human Nature. It appears to be gone. That's great content, and it's not the stuff that we've been arguing about. It was on the side of Ayn Rand, you know? I took the book Ayn Rand Contra Human Nature and I went through it and I pointed out a ton of ways it was wrong. And I posted my review. And I posted the link to it because it was it has a bunch of formatting. Like I used 3 different colors of quotes. And I used headings and stuff. I know people hate links, but like it's way better if you just click the link, and it's great content. And not all content can be copy-pasted into a mostly plain text form. I hope it didn't get deleted just for being a link, which would be very lame. On the other hand, if it got deleted for like content reasons, that could be even worse. Okay, so to summarize the point of the video, I wanted to show my thinking and writing process more. So you got to see how I go through some posts, think through. So I did thinking out loud about some posts at the beginning to show my thought process better and to share the kinds of reactions I have to posts and what I think about what kinds of points I have in my head when I'm reading the post. And then I wrote some replies and showed how I compose replies, and the writing went really quickly because I'd already done thinking out loud and as a longer process than I normally do, so it sped up the writing. And yeah, you got to see how I write replies. I talked about things like selection of what I wanted to quote and which issues I wanted to reply to. I talked about dropping some things and not replying to them, or why they're hard to reply to. So yeah, I basically just wanted to go through my thought process a lot more in ways that don't normally get communicated in my text-only posts. And I find that easier to do out loud in some ways. There's some advantages to just sort of talking a bunch. And I like the screencast format where you can literally see me writing. I think it provides some extra information that just seeing the finished post doesn't have, and maybe that'll have some value. Like you can see what order I write different sections of a post. You can see which things get edited, what stuff I edit versus what comes out right the first time, what stuff I go back and add more writing about versus just comes out the first time. Decisions about what stuff I think is like, this isn't good enough, I need to rewrite it, I need to delete something. There wasn't a ton of that because these posts were fairly simple to write for me, except for the part about solipsism, and they were, I thought out a lot of what I wanted to say before I started writing, so there were a lot fewer errors while writing, a lot fewer editing and going back and stuff. Like, because I sort of organized it in my mind more than I normally usually do before writing, so then there's a lot less organization in the actual writing phase. But you guys got walked through the whole process anyways with the talking out loud about my thoughts, so you still see the whole way I think through it. So hopefully this will be helpful for sharing my perspective and my way of thinking better, and where I'm coming from more. I think I get misunderstood a lot on the forum, and by having a different format, it may help get some different things across that weren't coming across. Like one of the things that happens, some people think I'm like angry or something, and if you hear me talking, then maybe you'll realize I'm not angry, like I don't sound angry. I've had that specific thing told to me that, you know, that someone thought that something I wrote sounded angry, and then they hear me talking in person and they realize, oh, he's not angry. Angry being something specifically that HB brought up in one post once, and I was like, no, I'm not angry. But there's lots of other things that sort of, stuff comes across when people talk that doesn't come across in their writing. There's differences. There's just sort of more information. You can get a little more of a complete picture of what someone's like. And also, this video is real time. Like, I'm not pausing to think, I'm not using a script. You get to see my actual, like, speed I do things as information that comes across. And you get to see bits of my process. Like I looked through some books on video, for certain parts. Not very much, but a little bit. Sometimes I do more. I went to a couple websites on video. You got to see my writing process, where I usually write in light paper, and there's other things. I wanna think it through more. Oh, right. So text posts are edited and polished. They're a lot less stream of consciousness, and they have less mistakes. Whereas when I just talk on a video, you get to hear like my initial thoughts, and if I have to say, no, never mind, let me correct that, you get to see that. You get to see like how much I'm messing up and fixing things in my process versus just going straight to the final thing I say. And that's kind of important and a big deal. Like how long does it take me to edit something and polish it? Am I like making 50 mistakes and I have to fix them all and it's this long process, or am I just writing quickly and comfortably with stuff that I'm familiar with offhand? Like you can get a different impression. So hopefully you learned something, both about my process, what I'm like, and also just about the topics, because, this is both to communicate about me and how I think, and also just to talk about the topics, because I talked about some interesting things about perception, about epistemology, and so on. All right, that's the end. Bye-bye.